Hello and welcome to the big special educational needs event. I thought about doing this for some time. It's going to be an event that will discuss various aspects of special educational needs law and all the kind of things that you might want to look out for. My name is Michael Charles and I've been practicing this subject for many, many years. And I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And I thoroughly enjoy talking to everyone here on Facebook. And I do hope that this presentation, which will be involving quite a lot of me throughout and others, will be well received today. And the idea really is to reach out to many people who don't easily get access to legal advice and assistance for various reasons. And this is a very difficult time for so many people, and particularly many young people in the autism community who are struggling at this time with the COVID-19 pandemic. And we all are struggling, I know, and it's causing enormous stress for so many parents. So the idea of this presentation is to try and assist you through the various aspects of special educational needs law, from what to do when you don't have a statement or you don't have an education healthcare plan, to what you might want to do about when you have a plan which is not particularly well worded. So the aim of today will be to take you right the way through that entire process. So the first presentation will be a presentation about the pre-statutory assessment stage. And that, of course, is the stage where we are looking about supporting a child who might not have all of the legal protection that an education and healthcare plan or statement will provide. So what to do, what to look out for there. And then later, when you cross that threshold and you think you've got a case that's worthy of a statutory assessment, what to look out for there, and what are the legal rules really in relation to securing a statutory assessment. And I will be talking about that. Later on, then that will be followed by a further presentation in relation to what's important about the education plan or the statement and how important the wording of that plan is. And then a colleague, Chris McFarland, will be talking about enforcing the plan and circumstances where you might have a plan that's not being properly complied with. And believe you me, I can tell you that there are many, many plans out there or statements of special educational needs out there that are not actually being properly complied with. So it's really quite important to look out for that part of the presentation to hear about what you might do and when legal aid might be in fact available to help those who need to have enforcement proceedings started. And that's, of course, we'll be talking about the distinction between the Special Educational Needs and Disability Tribunal and the High Court in judicial review, where certain circumstances you might need to use the High Court to try and enforce your rights. We will then be talking about if there's a dispute about the contents of the plan and you have to go to a Special Needs and Disability Tribunal. We'll be talking about the kind of things you might want to look out for there. And further, after all of that, if that's not enough for you and you're not thoroughly bored or perhaps even more excited by all of that, you might want to hear some more, because we'll be talking a little bit more. We'll be talking about the annual review stage and why that's important. And we will also be talking about the kind of things to look out for at annual review and why it's important, because it's often overlooked, believe you me. I mean, the annual review process is a time when people let down their guards. I mean, local authorities might not necessarily be properly prepared and the school may not be properly prepared. And a lot of children end up going through that process just like a tick box exercise, and it doesn't actually get done properly. And the distinction between doing that properly can make a whole world of difference, particularly when you get into the transition stage. And that brings me to the part of the presentation which we'll be talking about, which is, of course, the post-16 stage. And there's a distinction between what happens in Wales to what happens in England at that point in time. So there's a whole lot to think about, and there's a whole lot we will be covering. And of course, I'm going to be joined by a number of very, very prominent experts who's going to be assisting me today. And I'm very, very pleased to provide a very warm welcome to my guests, which will include Chris Wade, who's a very prominent speech and language therapist, working many, many years looking after children with special educational needs and navigating the tribunal process and fighting for on the part of many parents who might need his support. And we'll also be joined by Charlotte Hadfield, who is a dear friend of mine and a barrister at 3 Paper Buildings in London, works a lot closely with me in a number of cases, and she will be talking about the pre-assessment stage, the tribunal stage, and she'll be joining me in relation to the other aspects of education law, which we will hear about as the day progresses. Also, we have Melinda Silson, who is a wonderful occupational therapist, and she'll be talking about the pre-assessment stage, and she'll be talking about the statutory assessment stage, and including the point about what to do when you get to tribunal and the kind of inputs that she might wish to bring. And so she's going to be contributing a lot to the discussion today. And then furthermore, we're going to have some colleagues, other lawyers here at Sinclairslaw, who are going to also be assisting. And those will include Chris McFarland, who is a senior lawyer in the Welsh office of Sinclairslaw, and he'll be talking about enforcing education and healthcare plans, or the statement of special educational needs, if that is relevant to you in Wales. And we'll also be talking to Chris Barnett, who will be discussing the importance of the wording of an education and healthcare plan and the wording of a statement of special educational needs. And as you know, it's a live performance, and you hear the ambulances going by or the emergency services. I hope that's not because everyone's bored listening to me, but I'm going to, I hope you're going to enjoy this presentation today, because I can tell you it's going to be packed with a whole lot of information. I wanted to talk a little bit about just a topic really before we begin, and that topic is about contrasts of behaviors that you might see at home. You know, the typical case, it often happens with children with emotional difficulties, maybe autism, maybe PDA, that kind of condition, where you have contrast between the behaviors that are seen at home and those behaviors that you see at school. And recall my fictional character, Samantha, I think, and I guess these words might be words that you are often hearing from the school when they turn up and they say to you, well, Samantha appears to be a very happy and contented child, you say. Have you heard those words before? They're not really unusual, because irrespective of the fact that your home may appear as the aftermath of bitter conflict, and in the day when you're trying to work with Samantha at home, your home might feel a smouldering wreck that will turn ablaze once again when Samantha returns home from school. Yet this doesn't mean that the words are dishonest. You know, the school might be genuinely presenting an argument that Samantha isn't a problem at school, but Samantha is a particular problem at home. A different pattern of behavior is in fact extremely common because so many people just hold it together at school whilst melting down at home. Yes, it also works in reverse, and you have occasions where a child might be difficult to manage at school, and not so difficult at home, where you can let off some steam. I mean, it's not unusual for children to behave differently in different settings. I mean, those with anxiety, learning difficulties, ADHD, autism, their behaviors can vary very markedly. But neither does it mean that the problem should be ignored. And that's often the kind of thing that parents feel, that their problem is being ignored or they're not being listened to. And indeed, the whole aim of education really is to enrich the lives of young people so that they're able to apply what they learn at school later, both in society, maybe at work, and of course in life generally. I mean, a failure to display in everyday life the skills that are taught at school is very significant, because it's an indicator that things may not be working very well for the child. I mean, parents should never be encouraged to believe that what they are doing really is wrong. I mean, some have written to me on Facebook here saying, well, recently, in fact, saying that they've been accused of inventing their children's disabilities, and some are even threatened with care proceedings. And yes, it does happen, and it can happen. But much of these kind of wars, which I regard as unnecessary, are created really by those who simply fail to understand what disability is, and particularly fail to understand the conditions that that often are suffered by so many children up and down this country. I mean, Samantha works at school. She keeps herself in control, but at home she explodes into a rage, a kind of tidal wave, I guess, of bottled up emotions, bitterly taken out on you, exhausted parents. I mean, often others, such as, other conditions, I suppose, such as selective mutism, in those occasions, children might be happy and very talkative at home. And it may be very different at home, but when they go to school, they just don't want to talk at all. I mean, this child will sit in silence, perhaps, maybe not even asking to use the toilet throughout the day, in favour really of waiting until they get home. I mean, all the problems that might create. And there are so many different contrasts. I mean, many with anxiety or OCD symptoms may wish to mask their problems due to a fear of being considered different among their peers and to their teachers. I mean, that is another particular area of concern. I mean, the social perception of being fine, a kind of smokescreen, I guess, hiding the embarrassment they actually feel. I mean, it can be very, very testing for our children. I mean, for many children, utilizing all this energy at school leaves them without any reserves when they arrive at home. You can just imagine it. It's bottled up, they get home and they cause havoc too for you. And at school, of course, the difference is that in school there's structure, there's consistency, and that keeps them, if you like, well ordered. I mean, an autistic child will like to be well structured. A teacher with so much to get through in the day doesn't really have time to dawdle. A failure to comply with instruction may lead to an immediate sanction, an immediate consequence perhaps, and yet this kind of structure is not easily replicated at home, because experts may agree that life really isn't like that. I mean, it's just not like that, let's be honest. We don't have a set structured routine in every aspect of our lives. We just go about our lives and we just make the most of it over the weekends, etc. And we expect to let down that guard. I mean, sometimes, as I say, it also works in reverse, because the demands made at school are greater and very different to home life. This might trigger problems which are never seen at home due to the low frustration and tolerance levels and thresholds. I mean, this is common, particularly with ADHD, I suppose. Those with autism may be permitted ritualistic, self-directed behaviours at home, involving hours of sitting perhaps in front of a TV. I mean, like my son used to do, is just constantly looking at the laptop or the iPad, and there's a lot of computer time. And of course, those kind of behaviours can be allowed, if you like, or they are allowed to continue at home when there's this lack of maybe not so much structure, when that kind of behavior, if you like, or tendency is not really replicated, or it's not easy to do, because there's so many more restrictions that apply at school. So children become frustrated by an intolerable lack of patience. They're, after all, being prevented from resorting to what they want to do. And that will create lots of behaviours, perhaps, at school. I mean, in my view, the contrasts of behaviours are matters that require total respect and understanding from both sides, both from the teachers and from parents, understanding each other's perspectives. I mean, teachers and parents working closely together can derive from those facts strategies that can involve input from various other experts who will help, I hope, find a solution. I mean, this might include mental health services needing to intervene with very tested approaches, such as cognitive behavioural therapy. I mean, and it might also involve collaborative and open communication, which I think really needs to be something that has to be encouraged. I mean, look again really at the provision, look again at your statement or the record of need or the EHCP. I mean, are the words in that statement or in the EHCP sufficient, do you think? Is the communication between school and home sufficient? What works in one place may be in need of repeating in the other. Practice, after all, makes perfect. I know many of my friends here have stood accused of failing in some way, and some are even threatened with this court action. I mean, in my view, presumption can be extremely dangerous, because before turning to the court, really, the answer is to take time to listen, and take time to not only listen, but also to take time to be heard. From this derives better understanding, and with this, a greater chance for our children. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy today's presentations. Hello and welcome to the first of our seminars today, and we are going to be covering a whole load of topics, and I'm here today with a range of experts. We have Melinda Erickson, who is a fabulous occupational therapist with years of experience in dealing with the Special Needs Tribunal and doing occupational therapy assessments and appearing before the tribunal. Melinda, thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon.
We also have Chris McFarland, who is my right-hand man, excellent solicitor, worked with us for a number of years, having been trained at the firm of Sinclairslaw, and now is an excellent force to be reckoned with himself as a special needs lawyer. Chris, good afternoon. Or good morning, I should say, because this is recording in the morning.
Good morning, Mike, and hello to everyone.
And last but not least, we have the infamous Charlotte Hadfield, a wonderful friend of Sinclairslaw and a barrister who appears very often before the Special Educational Needs Tribunal and charms everyone to she very rarely loses any of her cases. Charlotte, good day.
Hi. I'm leaving.
You're leaving.
I can't live up to that.
Well, thank you to you all for joining us. And as I say, this is the first of a number of sessions that are going to be on today. And we're going to be covering, just so you know, as a reminder, we're going to be covering, this one is going to be about a little help at school, the pre-assessment stage, just when things really need to, you need to do a little bit more for your child. And then we're going to go on to cover later on today the statutory assessment and what you need to look out for in that process and what the law requires for local authorities to consider. And then we're going to go on later on today to the education and healthcare plan, or of course, if you're in Wales, the statement of special educational needs, and why all the words make all the very big difference to your case. And that will cover, of course, school provision, home education, and a whole lot more. And then we'll be going on to discuss the Special Needs Tribunal. I'll be also with the team here discussing that today and what you can expect and how to prepare for the tribunal. And then I think Chris McFarland is going to charm us all with a presentation on enforcing the education and healthcare plan and the statement of special educational needs and what you can do when things go wrong about that. And if you want to maybe think about going to the court, and there will be a little bit of a discussion about legal aid and when that can be accessed. And then right before the end of the day's session, we're going to be talking about post-16 and the importance of the annual review and good preparation for the longer term. So thank you all very much for joining us, and going back now to the very first topic that we're going to be discussing, when a little more help is needed at school. Now, so let's just visualize a child starts at school. We don't have an education plan, don't have a statement of special educational needs, but things are not going quite right. Melinda, from an occupational therapist perspective, what are the kind of things you think you would be looking out for, you know, with the environment and things like that?
I think one of the first things we see are children either becoming incredibly overwhelmed in the environment, and that can really lead to them either running away, sort of the fight or flight response. So they could start having a lot of meltdowns, refusing to go to school or expressing not wanting to go to school, having meltdowns, and these often are happening at home rather than in the school environment. So it usually is parents that are seeing this first. Other children really withdraw actually and slip under the radar. So that's one of the largest concerns as a therapist, because schools are very often not seeing any difficulties at all, but it's because the kids are actually just slipping under their radar.
And of course, it takes quite a lot of toing and froing to get to someone like yourself, an expert like you, to get involved. I mean, from the typical things that you might see, as you say, a child is starting at school, the environment might be overwhelming. I mean, you see that typically in autism cases, don't you, with sensory issues and things?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the biggest concerns is it's very often labelled as behavioural or difficulties with parenting, or the child's having behavioural problems, emotional outbursts, and the underlying difficulties are not identified.
Got some problems with the internet there, but let's hopefully that will be resolved in due course. But Charlotte, the SEN Code of Practice, I mean, provides, if you like, the framework for schools and local authorities about how to approach some of the difficulties that a child might have. I mean, and the emphasis really is on high quality teaching, isn't it? It's littered throughout the document. I mean, how does a parent judge when they're getting high quality teaching?
It's pretty difficult, isn't it? I mean, I think it's very difficult for a parent to be able to judge that, but I think going, I suppose, on the basis of the parents that we've worked with, I think the things that they tend to pick up on are, firstly, and I would say first and foremost, that they are starting to notice signs of sadness or anxiety or just a sort of lack of engagement from their own child. So that tends to be the first sort of sign of alarm, doesn't it? And then I guess what normally happens is that parents go and talk to their teachers, and a lot of parents that we've spoken to then come away with a sort of nagging feeling that perhaps the teacher doesn't necessarily understand exactly what's going wrong, or isn't sure of the right way to deal with the difficulties that the child has. But I think it can be difficult for parents because a lot of the time they don't necessarily know the full story in terms of what actually their child is going through, or what condition might be starting to sort of show its face.
And Chris, the school might implement certain strategies, mightn't it? It might say that, for example, let's take a child with dyslexia who's struggling with reading. They might commission an expert to come in, maybe, to provide some assistance.
Yes, absolutely right. I mean, I think, like Charlotte just mentioned, and what Melinda mentioned as well, when we have parents who notice something isn't right, either their child is reluctant to go to school or outright refusing to go to school, or possibly if it is something more related to academic performance, so they're getting school reports in, or they're going to parents' evening and concerns are being raised, the first port of call is to speak to the teacher. Speak to the teacher, see how they're performing in class, see if perhaps the anxieties or meltdowns you're seeing at home are being reflected in class. And then obviously, if the teacher also sees some of those behaviours, they may very well look to put in support kind of at the school level. So the school may have people who do extra reading sessions, for example, with a pupil with dyslexia, or obviously if they feel maybe more specialist intervention is required, maybe the SENCO in England or the ALNCO in Wales will be involved and see if further assessment is required as well.
Absolutely. And of course, that's for another session when we're going on to the assessment stage. But of course, the law provides a certain framework, doesn't it, Charlotte, about what a school can and should do, really, in relation to children who might have special educational needs.
That's right. The primary duty is really upon the school to use its best endeavours to ensure that children who need special educational provision get special educational provision. And the point at which that responsibility passes to the local authority, so the point at which you say to yourselves, well, actually, the school's doing everything it can, but the resources available to the school without an EHC plan in place are just not meeting my child's needs. That's not always easy to identify. But basically, when you're reaching a point where what your child needs is, it's not necessarily incompatible with the child staying in mainstream. It's not necessarily incompatible with your child achieving at a mainstream level, being we know that many children with special educational needs are very academically able and are able to excel with the right support in mainstream school. But it's really about identifying the point at which, in shorthand and without kind of reeling off a load of the Children and Families Act, it's about identifying the point at which the school, well, certainly in England, the test really is the point at which an English school can't really reasonably be expected to put in the level of support that the child needs out of their own resources, which of course are limited per pupil.
Yeah, quite. I mean, and the emphasis in the SEN Code of Practice is to involve parents as much as possible. Yeah, and
all the way through at every stage.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so when can a parent, what do you think, Melinda, when do you think a parent could be able to identify, for example, that this idea that tracking their child's progress and trying to identify when it's actually going wrong, it's extremely difficult, isn't it? When, particularly when you're looking at complexities like occupational therapy intervention, that kind of support.
Yes, definitely. And I think one of the themes here really is just the different child that you see at school and at home. And it's so difficult sometimes to get that across to a school that the child's building up their pent-up frustrations. I mean, sometimes it's really obvious because they're not actually making academic progress, or not making friends, or really struggling socially at school. But when a child is really able to mask that, it's just so important that parents follow their gut feeling and they follow their intuition, because parents really do know their children better than anyone, and they really need to follow that. They are their voice, so they have to just keep fighting. We see that all the time, don't we? That they really have to say the same thing over and over.
I mean, an interesting point in the SEN Code of Practice, and I've got it here on the screen just alongside me. One of the things, the objectives, is to ensure that the approaches used, that's the approaches used by the school, are based on the best possible evidence and are having the required impact on progress. I mean, how on earth can a school or a parent really try and evaluate that? I mean, in terms of a motor problem, for example, a speech and language problem, you know, communication, it involves a lot of some considerable thought, doesn't it, in trying to work out, you know, when things have got to the threshold where you need something more.
I think a good rule of thumb in practical terms is, you know, when you engage with the school, you engage with the teacher, and you engage with the SENCO, you know, generally, certainly at the initial stages, there'll be, you know, either they'll say there's no concerns and perhaps those concerns will grow, or if there are concerns, there'll be some enthusiasm that the school itself will be able to meet the child's needs, and it will look to put in place provision to meet the needs identified. But I think for parents, you know, I think what you're getting at is, when practically do you think, now I need to take it to that next level? And for me, I think there's kind of a twofold thought process that parents need to have. You know, firstly, you know, is what the school has been doing working? You know, so if they have put in intervention, obviously you need to give that a bit of time to settle in. But if it's been, you know, a couple of terms, a full academic year, 2 academic years, and the child is not making progress, and more importantly, if the gap is widening, you know, if other peers seem to be, you know, accelerating far beyond where your child is, that's, you know, kind of a flag there. And secondly, if you speak to the SENCO or the ALNCO or the class teacher, and, you know, and oftentimes teachers will say this, you know, they just don't know. They might say, we just don't know, let's try something. And it's where you hit that I don't know, or there's that lack of clarity after things have been tried. I think that's where you think, okay, maybe now is the time to kind of escalate it to that assessment level, because that's what the assessment, you know, is for. It's for identifying those needs that, you know, even for highly skilled teachers, you know, will need the insight and input of a clinician like Melinda or others, you know, to really understand the child's needs and understand what they require in the school to meet those needs.
But if it's based on the best possible evidence, I mean, so I gave a presentation not so long ago on pathological demand avoidance syndrome, and that's a syndrome or a profile that's not accepted as a diagnosed condition in this country, or sensory processing problems. I mean, it's accepted as a problem, but necessarily sensory integration therapy of the kind that Melinda might advise upon, it is something, again, there's trouble in recognizing as an identifiable approach. That in practice causes enormous problems, does it not? Well,
yeah. Are you speaking to me? Oh,
yeah, I was. Yeah, it was actually. Yeah, I was speaking to you, Melinda. Yeah, I mean, well, to anyone, really, to anyone. I mean, it's you know, I mean, the point I'm trying to get at, if you're trying to ensure that the approaches that they are actually used in the school, whether you're a school teacher or a parent, is based upon the best possible evidence, where does that leave someone where the evidence in this country is not necessarily to recognize the condition itself?
I think one of the main problems is, I have huge respect for teachers. It's an incredibly demanding job, but they're trained in typical development of children. And while they're very good at recognizing that a child might not be following the normal patterns of development, working out why, or knowing where special educational needs and how they're affecting the child, it's something that university courses don't actually provide within their training. So it takes a highly experienced teacher to really start picking up on these sorts of things. And every child is just so incredibly different. So, you know, as an occupational therapist who's seen thousands of children, you know, I still don't know everything about every different special need. It's a really complex area. So teachers just can't be expected to know all of this. And calling in experts as early as possible doesn't always happen, which really puts a lot of pressure on teachers to try and help children make progress without having that type of advice.
And Chris, we're going to see this, no doubt, in Wales, particularly with the legislation that's going to be introduced, which is all about teachers identifying and providing the support for children with special educational needs. And we're going to see that as a contrast to, if you like, what's in place in England, where the emphasis is on the local authority undertaking the assessments, etc. Whereas and schools are going to be at the very first point, you know, of the ladder, really, to try and identify what the support needs are.
Yes, absolutely right. So for those watching who may not reside in Wales or may not know about the legislative changes in Wales, the Additional Learning Needs Act is coming into force next year, September 2021. It was due to come into force this year, but they postponed that early enough that it looked like foresight to COVID-19 in the end. So it actually worked out quite well for the Welsh Government, I think. But in terms of, you know, the general structure, yes, you're right, Mike, you know, it is expected that the first point of assessment will be conducted by the school. Now, you and I, in separate seminars, long before the bill as it was became an act, as it is now, have expressed concerns about this, mainly for the reasons we've discussed here is, you know, at what stage, you know, can a teacher, you know, really understand the limitations of their knowledge? And it's the same with anyone, you know, as Melinda said, you know, she's a highly experienced, very specialist occupational therapist, but she's still learning, you know, obviously I'm still learning, you know, I'm a special education needs lawyer, but there'll always be a new variation on a condition, or a child may have different comorbidities. So they may have, you know, conditions I've seen before, but in a combination I've not seen before, and that affects the child in a different way. So there is really a myriad of presentations out there, and it can be very, very challenging. You know, I'm a solicitor, I am not a clinician, so I am not there to sit and assess a child. I'm there to obtain expert reports and follow those reports and apply those reports as the law requires. So when you think that, you know, someone doing that for a living is not in a position to really assess, you know, teachers, as Melinda says, they're very, very skilled. They do a fantastic job and a very, very pressurizing job. But to add the responsibilities of assessment on top of that, you know, I think we have some concerns about that. Now, in fairness to the Welsh Government, what they've made clear is that, you know, they're only expecting teacher assessments to be, you know, in Wales, as it still is now, you know, those children who are on School Action or School Action Plus. So to kind of explain that, those are the children that we were talking about earlier that need a little extra help in school, but really help that's available at the school itself. So the school will have the resources available to meet those children's needs, be it with additional reading classes, be it with a little bit of TA support in the class, but not the level of support and intervention that you'll see in a statement of special education needs or an education healthcare plan. So it's anticipated that that's where teachers will take a role, but then it's also expected that where teachers feel, right, it needs to go to that next level, they will then refer it on to the local authority. But I think, as we've all discussed here, that's always really challenging for teachers to know when. And of course, you know, and with great respect to local authorities, they have very small budgets and they are very budget conscious, as to a certain extent they have to be. But of course, as anyone who's dealt with them in special educational needs knows, that can sometimes come as a detriment to the child, that focus on the budget. So of course, if you have a local authority that has trained and told schools and teachers, right, you know, we don't have much left in the tank for special educational needs provision, so you need to do as much as you can in school, it can be quite intimidating, I think, for schools and teachers, both in the current system and definitely, I think, in the system to come in Wales, to really say, okay, you know, now we're going to flag it up. You know, I don't think any teacher or any school wants to be the problem school that keeps putting kids forward for further assessment. So definitely a concern from our perspective. But I think the rule that we've all said here is, you know, for parents, be vigilant, you know, be the parents you are, you know your children, keep an eye on them, check on their progress. If things aren't going well, open a dialogue with the school. And if you feel you're not being listened to, or if you feel that the school has given all the help it can, then take the initiative yourself to seek further support and possibly assessment.
And Charlotte, I mean, from the law, the legal perspective, children, of course, I mean, we talked about the expertise that might be expected of the school. But a lot of these children who don't have education plans or statements are expected, of course, to be educated in the mainstream school, are they not?
That's right. The vast majority of children with special educational needs will be in mainstream alongside neurotypical children. And
I think it's forbidden for them to go into special schools other than in exceptional circumstances.
It's always driven by need, and there is a strong statutory presumption in favour of mainstream.
No, I'm sorry, I'm talking about children without education healthcare plans.
Oh yes, absolutely. Sorry. Yes, yeah. That's right.
So children without a plan can only be placed into a special school in the circumstances as envisaged by the SEN Code of Practice. And to remind ourselves, that includes where they're admitted to a special school for the purposes of an assessment.
Yeah.
So there are limited circumstances where you're going to get the kind of expertise that Melinda, for example, was talking about, which we'd expect a school in order to track the progress on the best possible evidence. So you can see it's a real catch-22.
It's very difficult.
Yeah, and so from a practical perspective, I mean, a lot of problems that often happen, don't they? In a school situation, as a parent will go and visit the school, they will talk about their problems as maybe a teacher's evening or something, and they will have the conversation, and those conversations, of course, will be forgotten. The emphasis, one of the things I always advise upon, is when the conversation takes place and the school says they're going to do X, Y, or Z, or you say you're concerned about X, Y, or Z, to record it in a note, to record it in a diary, record it in a letter, record back and send back to the school what you've just discussed. So there's a real track of the progress in order to try and work out what the school's doing. I mean, do you think, Charlotte, that if in a case where, let's say, I'm just thinking up an example of a child, let's say, who has real problems with language, the acquisition of language from a very early age, and the school says, well, I'm going to get some speech therapy support, we're going to get some speech therapy advice, and then they don't do it. Do you envisage any problems that the school could face legally in those circumstances?
Well, they may well be. It rather depends on what resources the school has available to them. But I would expect that if the school doesn't have its own dedicated speech and language therapist, because of course increasingly we are seeing larger mainstream schools and academies that will say, well, actually we've got a speech and language therapist who will come in for a day or a couple of days a week and who will see children who need speech and language therapy, so you don't necessarily need a plan in order to get that. But I think that there are two difficulties really. The first is that lots of schools do not have access to that kind of expertise. They can consult the speech and language therapy service, but they don't necessarily have someone coming in who will see children who aren't in receipt of a plan. The second problem is that where schools do have somebody coming in on a sort of, for a day a week or a couple of days a week, a lot of the time, those therapists are not delivering direct provision. So they might be coming in to observe, to assess, they might be coming in to model training for teaching assistants. But generally speaking, the model is that the speech and language therapist, even if they're coming into the school, is going to be consultative, and the actual programs are going to be delivered by the teaching assistants. And I have seen Melinda make the argument many times in tribunal, rightly, that there are children whose needs are so complex that they can't really be left to carry out their programs with a teaching assistant, because the teaching assistant may be very skilled, but is not going to be able to identify when plan needs to be tweaked, when things aren't working, when a different approach needs to be taken, maybe when you need to consolidate or try something different. I think the difficulty that schools face is that if they don't have access to a speech and language therapist, what they really need to be doing is picking up the phone to the local authority or writing to the local authority and saying, we've got a child here with language needs, and we do not have at the moment the ability to give that child the provision they need. I mean, I would say, and I'm jumping the gun a bit here, Mike, because we'll probably talk about this later, that when you're seeking an EHC needs assessment, your best ally potentially is going to be the school. If you can have your school on side saying to the local authority, this child needs provision, this child needs provision that we can't give. Here are the difficulties that we're experiencing. Here are the difficulties that perhaps the other pupils or staff are experiencing as a result of the lack of provision. we're in danger of not being able to meet need at all for this child if you don't put something else in. That's a really potent weapon. And the difficulty, I think, for some parents is a lot of the time the school will say, and this comes back to Melinda's point about varying expertise in special educational needs amongst particularly, I guess, mainstream schools. A lot of the time the school will say, we will support your application for an EHC plan, but I have seen these documents, and some of the time, not always, but some of the time, what the school's really saying is, Mrs. Smith's a bit worried about Johnny and she's terribly upset, and we're getting a lot of interaction from her, so we're making this application. But the subtext of it is, we're making the application because she wants to, not because we feel as experts in teaching that this child needs that provision. And that is where your expert witnesses are really going to play a huge role in your application for an assessment.
But of course, we're not at that point in this presentation, are we? We're talking about a school that is looking at the problem and trying to resolve it. I mean, Chris, do you not think that a school could easily fall foul of the Section 66 duty to use your best endeavours?
Potentially. I mean, I think where Charlotte's pointed out that, resources are a factor for schools, whereas for local authorities that wouldn't apply. So I think that's a valid point. But again, it's always challenging for schools. And I think that, Charlotte's advice there, if there are any teachers or head teachers or Senkers watching, it is crucial. If you don't think you know how to meet these child's needs, let parents know and support them and help them with their application to the local authority. That's kind of, I suppose, the end of this pre-assessment process we're talking is actually making that application for assessment. But, for schools, when they're faced with the initial problem, they do have to listen to parents. They have to take into account what parents are saying. They have to obviously use their own expertise and their observations of the child to inform their approach to that child. And, it's very, very difficult because, as we've discussed earlier, every child has different needs. So you couldn't really put a one-size-fits-all approach. But absolutely right. The worst thing any school can do and the worst thing that any teacher can do is to do nothing. Okay? If there is a problem, take it seriously, do the best you can. And of course, if you feel that it's beyond your knowledge, or if you can't quite work it out, even if you think, I know I'm going to get this, but I'm just not sure, don't leave it up to your own expertise, raise that flag, get that assessment, that's that crucial next step.
But the school, Charlotte, is not on its own. I mean, it's not completely isolated. There's a relationship between the best endeavour duty and the duty to provide proper resources to the school, seen between Section 64 and Section 66.
Yes.
I mean, so really, my advice, I'll qualify a little bit what's being said. My advice to a Senko teacher out there who's concerned is to look first at the statutory obligation. The statutory obligation is, of course, to use your best endeavours to secure that the special educational provision that's called for the child is actually made. Now, of course, you may not have the resources to be able to deliver that, but you do have the opportunity to go to the local authority and say, look, we don't have the resources, and under Section 64, you're supposed to facilitate us to be able to comply with our duties. And so we need the resources. And that's where we can maybe see people like Melinda coming in, getting involved. Melinda, have you ever been involved in a case where there hasn't been an education healthcare plan issued yet, and the school has actually commissioned you to give advice?
Yes, I have. It happens very rarely, but it has, and it was a maintained school actually, the last time I had that. But just on that note, when you're talking about referring to the local services, very, very often schools try to, but they are rejected because they fill in the referral form incorrectly, or the child doesn't meet criteria. So I think one thing schools must be aware of is what the referral criteria is for OT or speech and language, so that when they do put that application through, that the child is at least acknowledged and receives an assessment or an advice clinic. Very often the referrals are rejected.
Charlotte, can you see any potential problem that, in that Melinda's example where a school has been rejected, that the local authority might fall foul of its own duties to provide support for children with special educational needs in its area?
Well, it comes back to that duty, doesn't it, to make sure that, the local authority's got a choice when it gets a call like this from a school. it, realistically speaking, it can either put more resources in the way of the school so the school can continue to meet or step up its meeting of the child's needs without an EHC plan, or it can say, okay, we've reached the point where the school has done everything it can, the school has discharged its statutory duty, which is sometimes difficult to identify because it's that kind of uneasy relationship between section 66 and the sort of part of the Act that's focused on EHC plans.
Yeah.
But you know, really, the local authority has to act one way or the other, it seems to me. That doesn't always happen in practice, as we know. But what should really be happening is that the local authority should either be properly engaging with the school to say, look, we don't think an EHC plan is necessary because we can offer this, and we don't need an EHC plan in place to offer that. Or they can say to the school, you know what, actually, you're right, we need to get an assessment in. So if they're not doing the assessment, then, or if they're not helping the school, they need to take some sort of action because the experts in education are telling them that that child's needs are not being met.
And of course, we mustn't forget, must be Chris, that there's also the dispute resolution mechanisms that still exist, whether you hold a plan or not.
Mm-hmm.
What I mean by that is that there's the responsibility on the local authority's part to try and resolve the conflict that might exist there.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think, you know, that's kind of moving on from that discussion with the school that we've started with, you know, now the interaction with the local authority. So either the school has flagged this, you have flagged this. And, you know, absolutely right. You know, that's where the local authority does have an obligation to work with you. And generally they will certainly try, you know, whether you think they're effective at that or whether they are genuinely effective at that remains to be seen in each case. But, you know, that's the first step, is kind of getting someone involved to discuss matters with you, you know, to try and work out, you know, what's going on and what needs to be done to help this child. That should always be the priority of every person in this process.
I mean, the SEN Code of Practice, I'm just looking at it here, says that local authorities should adopt a key working approach which provides children, young people and parents with a single point of contact to help ensure the holistic provision and coordination of services and support. Key working may be provided by statutory services in health, social care and education, or by the voluntary, community, private or independent sector. So there's quite a lot of information there to digest and all these sources of information. Yeah. So I suppose that's what the beauty is of an education healthcare plan or a statement, isn't it? It's bringing all this together in one place. Yeah. Well, listen, well, thank you all very much, because I mean, really the presentation about pre-assessment is somewhat limited, but there are things that you can do. I mean, we talked about the kind of things that the SEN Code of Practice talks about, and that is, of course, to ensure and promote good quality teaching. We talked about tracking, and we talked about making sure your evidence is kept in good order, and you keep on writing back to the school and so on to track the progress that you made. And what I mean by progress is progress in actually making your objections or concerns known, and keeping a record of that. And we've talked about the kind of science difficulties that you might be experiencing right at the early stages when your child goes without a plan or without a statement, and the kind of things you might want to look out for. And also we talked about the obligations that the school, of course, has to use its best endeavours to meet the special educational needs that the child might have. So whether you hold a plan or you do not, it really doesn't matter, because the obligation is still to provide for your child. And if your evidence is there and you've got good tracking of progress, you know, you could see yourself having a good case to ask for the statutory assessment, and then of course to a statement or an education and healthcare plan. And the law really is actually on your side in relation to that. And the SEN Code of Practice, in fairness, is on your side in relation to that. But of course, don't forget that you have got an opportunity, if you are really concerned and you're asking for an assessment, to even ask for your child to be placed into a special school for the purposes of an assessment. So that is another possibility. So that's probably all for this first session, unless I've missed something. Anyone want to add anything else before I close up? Well, that only leaves me to say thank you to all my guests for participating in this first of our presentations today. And if you have any queries or concerns or questions, you can always email me, drop me a message, or drop any of our panelists a message. You can email us at education@sinclairslaw.com. or just send you, as many of you do, send me a message on Facebook on my private messaging, and I'll do my best to answer it. I normally answer them over the weekends rather than in the week, so there may be slight delay. But I look forward to seeing you at the next session when I'm talking about assessments and statutory assessments and what you need to do in those circumstances. Well, thank you all very much for participating. Chris, thank you. Melinda, thank you. And Charlotte, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chris Wade, and I'm a consultant speech language therapist based over in South Wales. And in this webinar, I'm going to answer that simple question, or what relatively simple question: does my child need a speech and language assessment? So you're investing time in watching this webinar, and therefore I kind of feel like I need to justify what my experience is. So in a sense, to gain your trust, that I do know kind of this area. And therefore I'll explain that I qualified 13 years ago. I've worked as a speech therapist for those 13 years across 5 different NHS trusts in England and 2 in South Wales. I've worked in paediatrics for the whole of that time, with a bit of a stint in with adults with learning disabilities, but keeping a paediatric arm at the same time. I've worked across mainstream schools, community clinics, specialist settings, in colleges. I've worked in autism diagnostics, in intervention and in training, both in the UK and internationally across kind of 7 or 8 different countries. And in addition to that, I've worked in adolescent mental health. Over the past 5 years or so, I've specialised in or focused on kind of speech and language appeal assessments and been an expert witness at tribunals. So I hope that gives you a good grasp of kind of where my experience is and kind of how I'm able to talk about what we're talking about. So in today's webinar, I'm going to cover these 4 things. I'm going to talk about the speech, language and communication pyramid. I'm going to go into kind of why it's important that we respect and listen to parents, because when they just know something's not right, then they're usually right. Parents are expert parents, so it's something we need to always consider as professionals. And as parents, if you don't feel being listened to, then try speak to somebody else. If you shout louder, somebody will listen. We're going to go into when to seek assessments, and then finally what an assessment actually looks like. So as a speech therapist, when I'm talking through a child's strengths and needs, I'll refer to the language pyramid. So I thought I'd just kind of steal the language pyramid from another website to begin with, and then also kind of go through what it looks like and what's at each level, but kind of give examples for each level. So at the bottom of the pyramid, so right at the base, the foundation of speech and language development, or the communication development, are attention and listening skills. So a child with difficulty with attention listening skills, they may find it very challenging to focus on what's happening within a group setting. They may fidget quite a lot. They may need additional support in sitting still during carpet time. As they get a bit older, they might find it challenging to filter out the noises in the background and to in a sense, focus on what the teacher's saying when people are walking past them, for example. They may have particular difficulties in their ability to hear, whether it's hearing particular speech sounds or being able to kind of, in a sense, decipher what's being said to them at the kind of the hearing level. The next stage is playing interaction skills. And a child with kind of difficulties with playing interaction skills may not develop play in what we'd see as a typical way. They may not be kind of going through the typical stages of play. So children with play difficulties may find it hard to, in a sense, play with their peers. They may play by themselves more often. They may do more repetitive games because they're games that they're familiar with, and therefore they're confident in doing so and they're motivated to do so. They may find it difficult to kind of deal with change when a peer comes in and tries to play with them, and that changes the dynamic of the game. They might find that quite challenging. Moving up the pyramid, another example in terms of receptive language skills, which is understanding of language. A child might find it difficult to kind of listen to specific concepts used in the classroom instructions and used within kind of typical sentences for their age group. And that might be sentences from their peers, for example. And they might not be able to understand each of the words, retain some of that information or follow some of the information within the instruction. So some children might find difficulties with the words first, next and last, and they might swap them around. They might have difficulties with kind of following more complex instructions. So what we'd expect is for a child at 18 months to be able to follow a single keyword instruction, so point to the ball. And then as their child gets older, the number of words within the instruction, the number of keywords in the instruction will gradually grow to 2, 3, 4 keyword level. And therefore, what you'd see is a child that has may have difficulties in following the teacher's instructions or the adult instructions, or they might be on the periphery of the group and watching what their peers are doing, so they've got the context of what's happening. And in a sense, being the last child at playtime, when the teacher says, "Oh, everybody put on your coats, put on your shoes, and let's go," the child might be the last one. They might be kind of watching. Okay, what are they doing? Okay, all right, we're putting our coats on. Oh, we're putting our boots on. Brilliant, let's go. And what you often find is children that have receptive language difficulties can be quite good at masking. They can be, if they've got kind of skills in their interaction skills and they're relatively good in terms of their attention and listening skills, they could be quite good at masking. So they might be one of the children that is last out at break time, but because their behaviour isn't challenging, they're often the child that's often missed. Moving up the pyramid, we've got the use of language. So this is the ability to put sentences together, the ability to kind of reflect on what you've done during the school day and create what we call a narrative, or being able to answer WH questions. So what did you do? Who did you play with? Where did you go? Etc. etc. And be able to kind of give you so they come home from school, or you pick them up at the school gates and you'd be asking them questions. And this child may find it difficult to put together the sequence of what happened during the day. They might find it difficult to use the right pronouns. So they might refer to boys as she and girls as he. They may have difficulties with kind of creating what we see as a kind of a coherent kind of narrative, which would mean that they're whilst able to tell you what they did during the day, they might not put it in the right order. They might forget to put the linking words in, for example, or it might not make any sense whatsoever. So there'll be little clumps of, so I did X, Y, and Z, but they're not kind of linking all these ideas together. And then the last part of the language pyramid is the speech sounds, and that's the bit we notice immediately. But it's a cherry on the cake. It's as speech language therapists go in terms of the hierarchy and prioritization, it's one of the last things we work on. So these are the children that find it difficult to produce typical speech sounds at the age that they're at. So it might be a child that can't produce the sound k and changes it to a d sound, so cat becomes dat. They might find it difficult producing kind of multisyllabic words, and they might drop out syllables. So a word like language might be language. There's lots of things that could be going on there, and what we often find as a speech language therapist is that these are at the surface level, and these are things that you notice immediately, and because they're at the surface level, you notice them immediately, and they're the things that will typically, when you go into an assessment, they might be looked at in terms of, okay, your child can produce these sounds and they find it difficult to produce these sounds, but they may not unpick, or the speech therapist may not go on to do further assessment to look at the child's use of language, their understanding of language, their interaction skills and their attention and listening skills. And therefore, because it's at the surface level, you could end up being in a situation where a child has been assessed for their speech sounds, which is typical of age between ages 4 and 6, but no one's actually looked at their language skills. And as we can see from the pyramid, attention, listening, plain interaction, understanding of language, use of language underpin everything. And therefore, they all need to be considered when you're doing a full assessment, which we're going to go on to later. I did a webinar, actually not a webinar, I did a conference 2 years ago where I built the language pyramid, physically built it with very large kind of Jenga blocks. That was funny to watch. So I'll see if I can dig out the video and I'll share it. Now, this is something I feel very passionate about, and it's the fact that parents are experts in their children. there's lots of experts around you. There's educational psychologists, there's Senkos, there's teachers, there's pediatricians, there's occupational therapists, there's speech and language therapists. There's lots of people that are around you, but you're the expert in your child. And therefore, it's vital that as the expert in your child, when you've got a gut feeling that something's not right, that something's just amiss with your child's development, you've noticed something about the way that they're playing or the way that they're interacting with their peers, or you've kind of, in a sense, you've been at a play centre with your child or picking them up from football practice, and you've realised there's a difference between what they are doing and what their peers are doing. It's important to reflect on this, and I feel very important to investigate. If you've got a gut feeling and you investigate that gut feeling, and there's no issue whatsoever in terms of the child's speech, language, and communication skills, then there's no harm that's being caused. Whereas if you've got a gut feeling and you're going to the teacher and the teacher's saying, no, we have no concerns, they're absolutely perfect in school, but you still feel you have concerns, then I feel very strongly that it's something that as parents and as a family, that you need to push. So it's integral as a kind of independent clinician, and as a clinician when I was working in the NHS, it was an integral part of my role to listen to the concerns of parents, because more often than not, parents are right. And as a speech and language therapist, I'd always advocate for a speech and language assessment for the individual with SEN from the onset, so from the get-go, so we really get to know how to best support this young person. And unfortunately, more often than not, that child or young person will have either been known to speech and language therapy in the past, or they may not have been referred, but the likelihood is at this stage they've already been discharged. And what's really important, I feel, to consider is that in a sense, it's important to consider that just because they're not currently known to speech therapy, it doesn't mean that they do not have an underlying communication impairment that needs to be explored. And therefore, the likelihood is that we need to really kind of unpick where this individual's communication skills are. So as a speech therapist assessing children, I see my role as being a bit of a detective, like the image of Pikachu. And sorry, my son's obsessed with Pokemon at the moment. So as part of that, I ask a lot of questions, and these questions will be to people that are familiar. So I'll be using questionnaires, but I'll be using kind of specific questions that I've learned through multidisciplinary work and through the work in kind of the CAMS work that I've done in the past. So we're asking lots of questions. And these questions will range from birth all the way up to now, and real focusing on now, but really being able to, in terms of diagnostic work, unpick where the child's come to in order to get to where they are now. So I do love this picture, and I love this quote. So don't compare your child with another child. There's no comparison between the sun and the moon. Each one shines at its own time. However, whilst I totally agree with the principle of this wording, I think the fundamental reason I assess is to compare children directly with their peer group of typical developing peers, so that I can work out, as part of a multidisciplinary team around that child and around that family, what provision needs to be put in place in order for the child to meet their potential and smash through the kind of the diagnostic label ceiling that's been put on them. And therefore, as a parent or a carer of an individual who has SEN, some of the questions that you might be asked might be kind of, and this will most likely be from either a speech therapist or a psychologist. So it might be kind of, how was the birth? Were there any complications? Did the individual pass their newborn hearing assessment or the other kind of reflex assessments? How soon were you discharged, and did you end up going back into hospital? And then looking at the developmental milestones, because we've got kind of evidence and research has shown us kind of where children would typically be at certain age groups. So we'll be looking at what age did they sit up, when did they crawl, some children shuffle, some children don't crawl, when did they walk, aided and then unaided, and then from a speech therapy perspective, when were their first words, and then also I'm really interested in what were their first words. I know there's lots of kind of kind of different avenues in terms of looking at the what the child's first words were. As I specialise in kind of social communication disorders, I actually find that the children that I'm working with, their first words typically are around the objects that they're interested in, not around the people that are around them. Whereas children that don't have social communication disorders will typically, their first words will be around the people that are around them, so mummy, daddy, and or names of siblings, for example. And then I'd want to know kind of how did that child play, and how do they play at the moment, are there any difficult behaviours, because obviously we're thinking about behaviour, and thinking about the ABC around that as well at the same time, and then thinking, right, so from a communication perspective, where is this child's functional communication skills? How do you know as a caregiver or as a parent or someone in school, how do you know what they want? Do they gesture towards things? Do they take you to things? Do they indicate with their eyes what they want? Or do they just grab for things? Do they point at things? And then when you're out and about, or you see something that you might find as interesting, do they notice that thing? And do they try and get your attention or draw your attention to something? And do they comment on what they find interesting? So some children might just use their language to request things that are interesting, or use their communication skills to request things that they want, or get things that they want. But do they comment? Do they try and kind of create a shared connection? I'd also be looking at kind of for the more able, or the more kind of children that have more language, do they have friends? Do they see friends outside of schools, or school friends outside of school? And then from a medical perspective, so these are kind of a short list of questions. You could really go on for hours in terms of the types of questions you could be asking. But from a medical perspective, what's their hearing like? What's their vision like? And are there any other medical complications? So my friends think, as a speech therapist, my friends work in finance, they work in IT, they work in marketing, and they think all I do is play with bubbles or play with toys all day. And I do. I've got a PS4 in my room where I'm sat recording this, and that PS4 is used with an adolescent that I work with in order to work on functional social communication and social interaction skills. We use all the skills and all the tools available to us as speech therapists and as individuals working with children to really hone in on the child's interests. So an assessment doesn't typically look like an assessment. You'll typically be sent lots of questionnaires. There's one particular one that looks at, it's called the Children's Communication Checklist too, and that looks at particular communication styles, it looks at speech patterns, it looks at lots of different things. And that questionnaire will typically be sent to home and to school so you can compare the difference. Observation, so if I come to a school, I'll typically observe a child over a kind of one academic lesson, one transition from the academic lesson to the break time, throughout break, and then into the next academic lesson. And that's all part of the assessment. So it's looking at how that child's using their language skills, their communication skills. Are they interacting with their peers? It's looking at absolutely everything. And in a sense, when you're only looking at one child, you unlike teachers who have to be, in a sense, kind of looking at everything and considering where all the children are at the same time. When you're sat watching one child in school, you really get to see what's happening. And I think sometimes you're one of the first to notice that because you've got the privilege to just focus on one and not be distracted by everything else. And then as a speech therapist, I use a range of formal assessments such as the preschool KELF or the KELF-5 or the BPVS, and informal assessments. And some of my informal assessments will actually get me just as much information. I guess the big difference between formal and informal is formal allows us to compare pretty directly with their peer group in terms of percentile ranks, in terms of scaled scores, and etc. And then informal allows us to compare, but gives us, I feel, more of in addition, some of the qualitative data rather than just the quantitative data. And then when you bring it all together, you've got this dynamic assessment that's looked at kind of other people's interpretation and observations of a child. It's looked at their development up to now. You've observed them with their peers. You've observed them in the classroom group. And then you've also looked at them in comparison to their peers in a formal assessment. And then you've used some informal tools in order to gather some more information. So yes, I guess just like Pikachu, you're really, really unpicking what are the child's strengths and what are their special educational needs. So finally, I wanted to say a big thank you to Mike Charles for inviting me to speak on this topic, and an even bigger thank you to everyone that's attended the webinar and kind of invested their time in listening to my, in a sense, passionate ramblings as a speech language therapist. I do hope you've taken something away from what I've been talking about, and do feel free to connect with me, ask any questions, comment, etc. Okay, thank you for your time.
Hello and welcome to the Sinclairslaw series on special educational needs, the conference today, and of course welcome to this presentation on assessment of special educational needs, which is the very early stages of the educational evaluation and the legal process that starts whether or not you have an education or healthcare plan or a statement of special educational needs. And my name is Mike Charles. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Sinclairslaw. I'm a lawyer and I've been working in this subject for a long time now. In 2020, you would think that nobody should be deprived of an opportunity, yet so many people are left out. They fall through the cracks in an education system wide enough to leave 1 in 5 adults in the UK unable to read. It's extraordinary, really. That's 1 in 5, and that represents a staggering 9 million adults. The problem is not unique to us here, but the same applies all around the world. In the United States, for example, 30 million adults are said to be unable to read, and apparently Australia may be even worse. Yet there is little doubt that inability to read traps people into poverty. It even reduces their life expectancy, and it's frankly really a national tragedy. According to the National Literacy Trust, a child born in Stockton-on-Tees has a life expectancy 26.1 years shorter than a child born in North Oxford. Imagine it. Imagine not being able to read road signs, instruction leaflets, medical directions, books, internet, newspapers, application forms for job interviews. All of that would be beyond the reach of so many people, those who cannot read. But of course, education is more than that. It involves developing numeracy skills, life skills, independence skills, and social skills, of course. It's hardly surprising, really, that the Institute regards inability to read as a lifelong disability. The conventional method of teaching phonics, which has undoubtedly improved literacy skills all around the UK since its introduction in the 1990s, does not work for all children. Some need to decode in very different ways. Children who are taught phonics may end up adopting a sight recognition strategy, which some may say puts them further behind in their reading and spelling. Scientists studying the brain, for example, have found that dyslexic adults who become capable readers use a very different neural pathway than non-dyslexics. I guess what I'm really trying to say is that there is never a more significant time than childhood to map out a strategy that works for the individual. This requires a proper assessment of need from a very early age. For me, the very fact that so many people are leaving school without the ability to read strikes as a national tragedy. So large, in fact, that this country and others around the world with similar statistics really should hang their heads in shame. The system plays a part in letting far too many children with very unique needs fall through those cracks, and those cracks are between opportunity and poverty, and it can make a big difference even between life and death. A person who cannot read may not understand how to read important health and safety leaflets, medical leaflets. I remember years gone by a case involving a young lad who acquired a very serious brain illness because of his inability to read and take precautionary steps as instructed in the leaflets that accompanied a potent weed killer product. So many children often live in isolation because they may have a learning need that has not been properly understood or addressed. They develop a feeling that they do not belong perhaps at their school because they may lack the ability to converse with their peers. Some are bullied with devastating consequences. If their needs were properly understood and met, it is possible that they might not have suffered anything like the harm that they in fact had ultimately suffered. In my job, over more than a quarter of a century, I've experienced cases that are truly horrible. Youngsters with little road sense being fatally struck by a vehicle, and others who have taken their own lives because they've never really felt understood. Believe me, the fundamentally important initial stage is to undertake a proper and detailed assessment of needs. This seminar, and indeed all the seminars that you will see today and throughout the weekend, will take a closer look at the law governing assessment of children and young people in England and Wales. Both jurisdictions include a statutory code of practice. Whether you're based in England or Wales, the Education Authority is obliged to have regard to the code. However, the code is not, as some believe, representative of the law. It is in fact guidance, albeit useful and very important. In Wales, the guidance must be considered due to Section 313 of the Education Act of 1996. In fact, that was legislation that was previously in force in England before the passage of the Children and Families Act. The guidance itself in Wales is produced by the Welsh ministers, and the code must be understood and applied, unless, of course, to do so collides with the primary statutory duty. An interesting argument exists here, and that relates to whether a duty that befalls a local authority in other legislation, such as that within the Children Act, including the duty to have regard to the welfare interests of a child, or the duty to offer services consistent with the obligation to safeguard and promote the welfare of children, should have a part to play overall in education cases. Case law has in fact established that the paramountcy principle under the Children Act of 1989 does not actually apply in special educational needs proceedings. Therefore, unusually, it is argued that a child's needs are not elevated above all other considerations, including cost, provided, of course, that the local authority on that which it offers is in fact suitable. Some lawyers express somewhat bewilderment in regard to this. I mean, given that a tribunal must nevertheless operate within the existing law, statutory obligations that exist, including the umbrella obligation to safeguard and promote the welfare of children, remains, in my view, a very relevant factor. In my view, education law does not sit in a vacuum, and neither should a tribunal sit in such a vacuum, in circumstances, for example, where a particular decision may, on the evidence, be likely to harm a child. Believe me when I say to you, decisions can benefit, and they can actually also cause equally real harm. I have been in this job long enough to know this. I've been in the very unpleasant place of having to advise a bereaved family whose child has been lost due to fundamental failure on the part of the school to have understood and appreciate the size of that child's problems. Life for children these days is all the more difficult. Bullying is no longer constrained to merely the school day or to physical altercations. Harmful consequences of social difficulties can lead to cruel behaviour 24/7 on the internet through social media, platforms and the like. These taunts do not simply go away, and the feeling of emotional exhaustion, perhaps due to social difficulty or language deficits, can have a material impact on one's mental health. Too many children today are being excluded, for example, and they're excluded often from school. Such decisions can be devastating. It can be causing deep emotional scars, yet the child might have simply been misunderstood, or he may not be able to even understand or appreciate why he's doing what he's doing is in fact wrong. A local authority is under an obligation to provide that which is reasonably required in law. I spoke about this recently at a PDA event when I was looking at the case of a fictitious child with pathological demand avoidance syndrome. A child with PDA, for example, may use various strategies to resist the ordinary demands of life. He might distract the adult. He may acknowledge the demand but seek to excuse himself from it. He might procrastinate and may seek to negotiate or even withdraw into fantasy. He might resort to physical outbursts or even attacks, and with that, he might also be excluded from school. An assessment might have made all the difference to that child. When deciding what a child might need, it includes consideration of not only what a child might need in the immediate term, but what might be required in the longer term. This is in fact a relevant factor in not only determining how a statement of special educational needs may read, but how an education healthcare plan, which of course applies in England, may need to read, but also whether to assess the need for one in the very first place. In Wales, an assessment is required when a local authority is of the view that the child has special educational needs and that it is necessary to determine the special educational provision that the child may require. Therefore, the first question is whether special educational needs actually exist in the first place. Well, the law in Wales defines special educational needs in section 312 of the Act. Section 312 says really that a child may have special educational needs if, for the purposes of the Act, the child has a learning difficulty which calls for special educational provision to be made for him or her. I mean, a child has a learning difficulty for the purposes of the Act if they have a difficulty or significantly greater difficulty in learning than the majority of children of that same age, or that they may have a disability which either prevents or hinders them from making use of educational facilities of a kind that might be generally provided for children of that child's age, or of a kind generally provided for children in the schools within the area of the local authority. Therefore, needs, as in what a child may need, means that which is reasonably required. Section 323 then states that where a local authority is of the opinion that a child for whom they are responsible has special educational needs, and it is necessary to determine the special educational provision which any learning difficulty he has or she has may call for, then an assessment will then be needed. Special educational provision in Wales is currently defined in subsection 4 of section 312, and that really requires, or it means I should say, educational provision which is additional to or otherwise different from the educational provision made generally for children of his or her age in schools that are maintained by the local authority. This really means that there's a duty to assess when the local authority is of the opinion that the child for whom it is necessary to determine special educational provision, and secondly, whether the local authority is of the opinion that the child is probably a child for whom it is necessary to determine special educational provision. Parliament did not rely on other more general statutory obligations, including the obligations that befalls a school to use its best endeavours to secure appropriate educational facilities for a child. I mean, the same provision also applies in England in the law, whereas a statutory duty exists on a school in England and in Wales to exercise the best endeavours to meet the special educational needs that a child might have. In Wales, the tribunal's consideration of whether an assessment is in fact necessary should never, however, be determined by the fact that a statement of special educational needs may not be required or likely to even result as a result of that. Therefore, in Wales, the threshold for an assessment is met if it can be established that it is necessary for the local authority having to determine the special educational provision that the child may require. In England, the test is quite different, well, slightly different in fact. The test here is whether it may be necessary for special educational provision to be made in accordance with an education and healthcare plan. Thus, not merely whether needs require determination, but rather whether provision may be necessary in accordance with the plan. This is somewhat slightly different than that which currently applies in Wales, and in England there's a two-stage test. The first stage is for a local authority to determine whether it may be necessary for special educational provision to be made in accordance with an education healthcare plan. It is the local authority that makes that decision, in consultation, of course, with the child's parent or the young person. At this stage, the statutory provisions do not provide for a duty to assess. Therefore, we must move to the second stage. The second stage arises where the local authority has determined that it may be necessary for special educational provision to be made in accordance with an education and healthcare plan. Therefore, an assessment will become necessary if the local authority has determined both that a child may require special educational provision and that the provision should be made in accordance with a plan. You confused yet? Don't worry, I know it's complicated, but doesn't need to be that complicated. A primary way to really think about it is, are your child's special educational needs fully identified so as to determine the provision that may be required for him or her? If not, then it's difficult for the council to argue that an assessment isn't necessary, because special educational provision would have not then been determined. Yet clearly it may need to be determined. In fact, evidence of deterioration or indeed failure to make progress at school may be a material factor to consider there. If needs are identified, then what provision is required is the next point really. Is that provision different from or additional to that made generally for children of the same age? That's the next point to maybe think about. If the answer to that question is yes, then is an education healthcare plan likely to be necessary? And of course that's the distinction, because that's how it applies in England rather than how it applies in Wales. Another seminar will address the law in regard to whether a plan is in fact needed. Broadly, however, it is fair to say that one, that is a plan, may be needed if the evidence suggests that the child requires support over and above that typically available for such children in the maintained sector. And the situation there is the same in England as it is in Wales. It's exactly the same. Does your child require support beyond that which is typically available within the resources of a typical mainstream school? The law requires, of course, the local authority to notify you of the outcome, and also to notify you of your right to express views and to submit your own evidence. And if after considering all of this information, it considers that there is a duty to assess, then of course the local authority will consider whether your child might require special educational needs and whether, and of course, special educational provision is necessary to be made in accordance with an education and healthcare plan. So what happens in the assessment itself? Well, in Wales, a local authority is obliged to follow statutory regulations. That requires a local authority to obtain certain information. For the purposes of making an assessment in Wales, a local authority will need to obtain advice from the child's parent, so of course you'll be asked to produce your own representations, make your own thoughts known. Educational advice, and that of course will include advice from the school. Psychological advice, and that's broadly really an educational psychologist's opinion. And advice from social services and any other advice which the authority consider may be appropriate for the purposes of arriving at a satisfactory assessment. And all of that advice that I listed there must be written advice, and it must be relating to the educational, medical, psychological or other features of that young person's case, which appears to be relevant to the child's special educational needs, including, of course, their future needs, and how those features, how those needs really could affect the child and those circumstances and the provision that the child might in fact need to receive. A person, that is an expert who the local authority might have commissioned, will need then to take advice from other people that they might consider necessary to consult. It might be that the psychologist wants to talk to a speech therapist, or the psychologist might want to talk to the GP, etc. And the local authority must also provide that person that it seeks advice from copies of any representations that you as a parent might have submitted, and any other evidence that a parent might have provided. And of course there's quite a lot of talk on the streets about whether independent experts can in fact be a redundant exercise. In other words, is it in fact needed? Well, generally the law in Wales, as it is in England, which I'm going to come on to discuss in a moment, does require the local authority to consider that information, all of the information. It should not constrain itself merely to the information that it itself obtains. If a child has a visual or hearing impairment, the advice must include also advice from an expert in those fields too. I said I'd mention the law in relation to England and of course what the local authority must obtain there, and it's very, very similar really to that which must be obtained in Wales. And the first thing that the local authority must obtain is advice and information from the parents. And you'll be asked to make representations. You'll be able to talk about the history, the problems that you might have experienced from a very early age and how the child has developed, etc. Then it must obtain educational advice, and that of course will include information from the head of the school or the post-16 institution if you're going for an assessment for someone beyond school. Or in fact, if there's no school, the institution that the person might be attending, and if that person doesn't attend any school, then the person who is broadly responsible for the educational provision for that child. And that might include, of course, yourself if you're home educating them, or a tutor that you might have commissioned in order to assist your child. And if any parent of the child or young person is serving in Her Majesty's Armed Forces, also, believe it or not, they must obtain advice from the Secretary of State for Defence. I mean, that's an unusual thing. Perhaps most people don't realise that, but you must obtain that. A local authority must also obtain medical advice, and that might be advice in relation to the child's obvious healthcare needs, if there are healthcare needs. But of course, it may be necessary to obtain specialist advice. It might be necessary to look at something more complex, a specialist in a particular area of medical science. The authority must obtain psychological advice, and that will of course be including educational psychology advice. But it's interesting because the legislation says psychological advice and information from an educational psychologist. So arguably the two broadly sit side by side, but it could embrace some other expert psychological evaluation. Advice and information from social care, that's important, and often you'll see a local authority assessment not even obtaining any advice from social care, and particularly for children who may have very complex needs or emotional and behavioural problems, it may have an impact on their social care needs, and that is something that you should also be watching out for. Advice and information then that the authority might consider appropriate from some other person, that might be necessary. But where the child is in year 9 or beyond, advice and information must include provision or advice in relation to the preparation of that for that young person for adulthood and independent living. The authority must obtain advice and information from any person that the child's parent or young person reasonably requests that the local authority seek advice from. Well, there you have it. Your independent reports are important because the authority must take into account that advice. Where it appears to the authority also that a child might have a hearing impairment or a visual impairment, it's necessary to obtain advice from someone who has expertise in relation to that area. And believe you me, I've seen a lot of times when the authority have not done that, even though they may have a hearing impairment. And that would normally include a specialist teacher advice. And the same applies, as I mentioned a moment ago, in Wales. All of these are clearly lots of very important stages that a local authority must take. They're important steps in order to evaluate and fully appraise the needs of your child. And if we make sure that those steps are properly followed, you should be in fact in a good enough position to be confident that you're going to get a robust assessment. And in further seminars we'll be talking about what you can do with that assessment and how that translates into decisions about whether there should be a statement of special educational needs issued or whether there should be an education or healthcare plan issued if you are living in England. But if we make sure that that's done properly, then a child can be properly evaluated. A child can properly look forward to provision that is going to meet their needs. And with that, that's the first rung in the ladder. That's the way you get to the success. And that might lead you to various different routes. It might include going to an independent school. It might include going to a specialist college, maybe even a residential school or a residential college. All of those things are important. They're all material things that are open to you if you get the right assessment. Well, thank you for listening. I hope this has been informative, and watch out for the further seminars later today. Thank you. Well, you've got your education and healthcare plan, you might have got your statement of special educational needs, and this presentation is going to be about really what you would want to see within the statement of special needs, or what you might want to see if you're living in England within your education and healthcare plan. Here we are at our Sinclairslaw Central London office, and I'm going to be joined today in this presentation by Chris Barnett, one of our senior education lawyers with an expertise in special educational needs. Come and join me. In England, Chris, there used to be statements of special educational needs, didn't there?
Yes, until a few years ago when they decided to amend the system and supposedly improve it. In the end, the changes they made were fairly limited.
Do you think it was an improved system with the education healthcare plan?
A lot of the changes ended up being fairly cosmetic in many respects, and the format is different, but the content for statements and EHC plans is often quite similar still. The main change that really had a substantive effect in England was extending the age range up to 25 for young people to have EHC plans, whereas statements are still limited up to the age of 18, so that one can have a lot more support in place for longer with an EHC plan. But the actual provision within an EHC plan, in educational terms certainly, isn't that different from what you would get through a statement.
So in Wales, the system is, we call it a statement of special educational needs, and of course in England it's an education healthcare plan. What would you say the primary differences are between those two regimes? I mean, you touched on some of them about extending up to beyond school. What else? Would you say the general position about the need for them to be specific is pretty much the same though, isn't it?
Yeah, the legal framework is essentially the same in that regard. It's certainly in relation to the educational provision. Obviously EHC plans also include a lot more non-educational provision in terms of health and social care, which is supposed to also have a level of detail in it, but not in the same way. And the focus in terms of legal issues is almost always going to be on the educational aspects of the plan primarily, as it is with the educational provision in the statement.
Do you think that social care is an important dimension in an education healthcare plan, do you think?
I mean, it certainly does allow an extra level of argument and an important addition to the armoury when it comes to making appeals and challenges to EHC plans, to be able, more than we ever used to be with statements, to rely on social care issues and social care provision. It's still possible to do that within a statement as well, and so that's not ever been impossible to achieve. But having it directly set out in the plan certainly does give that extra string to the bow when it comes to appeals.
Yeah, and of course healthcare provision too.
Yes, and health in the same way does the same thing, and having more enforceable rights in relation to health than there are with social care under an EHC plan is also quite useful when it comes to not just appeals regarding the educational side, but actually taking forward health provision properly as well.
So whether you've got a statement of special education needs or an education healthcare plan, I mean, they're still broken down into primary sections, aren't there? I mean, there's the special educational needs section of the document, where you describe the special educational needs provision. What would you say generally how that should look?
So I mean, whether one's talking about part 2 of a statement or section B of an EHC plan, which is where the needs are set out. I mean, the starting point in the code of practice is that the plan or a statement is supposed to be clear and concise and accessible, so that anyone, whether it's a parent or a member of staff at a school or a professional, can pick it up and understand that child or young person's needs and the difficulties that affect them. And so the starting point that one looks at when reading through section B is whether or not it gives a clear picture and an understandable picture of a child's difficulties and the reasons for that. Obviously, one looks first of all for recording of particular diagnoses, if there are any, but it's not necessary to have that, and some young people don't have a diagnosis, or a clear one anyway, and it's more of an explanation then of what the impact on them of their undoubted difficulties still is.
And so would you say that, I mean, sometimes a lot of people get confused by terminology. I mean, lots of medical terminology, psychological terminology. Would you say, in your opinion, there should be a better description of what the impact of that diagnosis is in layman's terms?
Yeah, I think that helps. I mean, obviously, having a particular diagnosis recorded can be important,
yes,
if there is one, because that may, for a professional and for a medical person, give rise to certain consequences in terms of what may be needed by way of provision and the right way of approaching a particular child's needs. But as I say, the aim is for it to be understandable for everyone. So if it does use a medical term which is an unusual one, or not one which everyone is going to be familiar with, then it's important that it also spells out in some more detail what the symptoms of that are, or what the consequences of that are for the particular young person.
And would you expect any social care descriptions to find their way into the description of special educational needs?
I mean, obviously, when it comes to an EHC plan, there's a separate box now, which is section C, for setting out, section D for social care needs, section C for health needs. So there's less of that would be needed within section B. Now, within part 2 of a statement, where there's obviously not as much room for non-educational things to be included, there's always been scope for either section B or part 2 to include more than just the very limited wording that's required to describe educational need. It can describe more about a child's situation and difficulties than that by way of sort of narrative explanation. And so where that's relevant and important, it can be included and maybe should be.
So really the idea is to get as much into the section B part of the education healthcare plan, or section 2 of a statement of special education needs, as you can, really. I mean, to make sure everything's covered and the ramifications of the need.
Yeah, I mean, there's a balance, as I say, between being detailed and being concise. And these days, concision is not really something that's often there. And plans in particular, and statements as well, get longer and longer, I think, over time. But certainly within section B, it's important to have that detail, not least because that leads on to the provision in section F. And what the law requires is that provision in section F meets all of the needs set out in section B. And unless one has all of the needs, therefore, made clear in section B, there is going to be a shortfall in provision. Yeah.
So, I mean, when you set out, for example, let's say we'll call a child an example, we'll say Jackie. Jackie has got autism with specific learning difficulties. What would be the kind of descriptions do you think you might want to, or you might typically see in Jackie's statement of special educational needs or the education healthcare plan?
So you're talking about section F now? Or...
Section B. I
mean, with section B, as I say, obviously it would record the diagnosis and the difficulties. You'd then be looking, because most local authorities will split the section B or part 2 into sort of subheadings, and will cover things like cognitive and learning difficulties. So there will be some assessment of what cognitive level the child's at. I mean, autism is a good example because obviously it's a spectrum condition, and so the impact on a child can vary quite a lot. And there will be children who are high-functioning autistic, whose cognitive ability underlying that, once one deals with the autistic effects, may be very high, and that obviously would need to be recorded. There are also children with more classical autism and more severe autism whose underlying learning ability and cognitive ability will be very low. And assessing it can sometimes be difficult in those cases, but you'd expect to see some explanation of their cognitive abilities and expected abilities.
And communication abilities.
And obviously then communication, which is often one of the separate subheadings that is dealt with, because it's a big issue, obviously, for autistic children and children generally, to ensure that communication and interaction, both speech in the literal sense, but also social interaction and social communication, is obviously a big issue for autistic children. And
would you, if you had a social care advice at that point, for example, describing the full impact of Jackie's social integration difficulties, would you expect some of that to find its way into the description of special educational needs?
As I say, it will depend on to what extent it's also dealt with in the social care section, and it may be that a social worker's report and the provision or the needs that they describe there would best be set out at that stage within section D, rather than as part of section B as educational needs. But it does depend on how one reads it, and there may well be useful information within a social worker's report which would still go into section B.
In your practice, do you see a lot of people complaining about section 2 or the description of needs as part B of the education healthcare plan?
It's generally, when one gets an EHC plan, obviously you read through it in order, or at least you look at section B before going on to section F and section I as the main educational sections. With Section B, certainly from the point of view of a lawyer, it's a lot more difficult when you haven't seen any reports at that stage to assess whether it's right or wrong, or obviously you can see if it's far too short or lacking on a lot of detail, or if there are whole sections which are just left blank, even though one would generally expect for an autistic child, for example, that the sensory section would have something in it, because it's rare anyway for a child with autism not to have those sorts of difficulties. But with Section B, it's far more common for it to be better than Section F with local authority drafting, not least because local authorities obviously will have a lot more information about need generally than about provision from reports, and for local authorities to put in a lot of detail about what a child's difficulties are is not as complicated as it is to then make proper provision, and it doesn't impact in the same way on resources and everything else.
And then statements, if we're dealing with Wales, the statement will set out the objectives that Jackie, in that instance, would be expected to have for them, set for them. And the same applies in education healthcare plans, but they're a bit more smart, aren't they? There's outcomes that are described.
Yeah, I mean, they call it outcomes rather than objectives. And there's obviously a lot of overlap between the two.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's something of a difference in terminology rather than a difference in intent, certainly. That the idea is still to record what the purpose of the provision is and what's hoped to be achieved by it. Outcomes are supposed to be smart in the SMART sense, and but objectives were always meant to obviously be focused in that way as well, and the SMART type approach was still a sensible one to use for those sorts of objectives to make them clear. But I think historically they were left fairly vague, and part of the change in the English system was to sort of put some more focus on that, or at least to give some more thought to it when preparing a plan to identify what the long-term and short-term aims of the provision are.
I mean, that's going to be for another presentation. We're going to be talking about annual reviews, about outcome setting, each year. But the outcome and the objective, there is a relationship, isn't there, between what you describe in the special needs section, what you describe as outcomes, with some would say, the most important part of the plan, which is, of course, the provision.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a relationship which a lot of local authorities get wrong to some extent, where they start off with the outcomes and then go on to define provision to achieve those outcomes, whereas the starting point ought to be that the provision is there to meet the needs, and the provision should meet all of the needs, and the outcomes are what flows from the provision, or what is hoped will flow from the provision.
Yeah.
And so there is often... It doesn't help that the Code of Practice puts outcomes before provision in terms of the sections. It puts it at E before F. But logically, anyway, within the structure of the wider scheme, Section F would come first, because that's the provision, and then the outcomes are what's intended to be achieved by that provision.
And we see that quite a lot, Chris, don't we? We see some backward thinking, really, where a decision is made about a school, and then we go back and describe whether or not the provision should fit that school.
Yeah, I mean, backward thinking about schools is probably even more common than backward thinking about outcomes. But equally, you will see local authorities whose plans will say, as a standard form, provision required to meet outcomes, and it should be provision required to meet needs.
Yes.
And as I say, they don't always.
I think you're referring to paragraph 969 of the Code of Practice.
Yes.
The provision. Yeah, quite. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, so when we've set this special educational needs, the description of special educational needs, and we're talking about the relationship between the special educational provision and the non-educational provision, etc. What would you, in Jackie's case, for example, what would the kind of terminology would you expect to see in the provision part of the plan or the statement?
So when looking at provision, and again, when one picks up a plan for the first time to review it, looking at the provision, the first thing that you're looking for is specific details of provision. The law requires specificity when it comes to what's set out in Section F, and it's most often the biggest issue with plans that are issued by local authorities is a lack of specific details as to the provision that's required. So what we're looking for when we talk about being specific is quantification of provision, details about how often it will happen, so whether it's 30 minutes a week, or an hour a fortnight, or an hour a month, or 30 minutes a term. They're all specific levels of provision. Obviously, they should be evidence-based and determined based on the professional recommendations. But it's that sort of detail in terms of quantifying the amounts that are involved that we're primarily looking for when it comes to.
Do you find in your practice that local authorities will often say certain things that you're seeking to put into Section F or Part 3 of a statement, the description of provision, really is a non-educational need, and we really shouldn't put that part in? Social care, for example, or healthcare arguments. I mean, speech and language therapy, sometimes local authorities have argued historically should not ever go part in the education healthcare plan and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it's still an argument that gets raised, and sometimes there is potentially merit to it, but things like speech and language therapy, for example, which, although historically has been argued to be non-educational, has long been determined since the 90s to be educational provision in pretty much every case. And it's rarer nowadays to see local authorities trying that one. Obviously, with social care and healthcare, there are separate sections within certainly the EHC plan, and there's the non-educational section in a statement, which is where that provision would be set out. But obviously, within EHC plans in particular, there's the issue of whether provision is properly classified as being educational or health or social care.
Should a parent be worried if they're living, say, in Wales, looking at the statementing regime, for a local authority to argue speech and language therapy is a non-educational provision, for example?
Yeah, I think that would absolutely be an issue, because, I mean, obviously the main concern about non-educational provision is that it's not enforceable in the same way as educational provision is. So even if the plan sets out a quantified amount of speech and language therapy as non-educational provision, or a statement does, then that's not going to be enforceable if the local authority doesn't ensure that it happens. So, as I say, where there is certainly a long line of case law to make very clear that speech and language therapy is educational provision. If a local authority tries that and, despite arguments, puts it into the non-educational section, or doesn't put it into a statement at all, then that's certainly something that we would say should be challenged, and would have a good chance on the face of it of being a successful challenge. So,
what about occupational therapy? Jackie might require some occupational therapy.
Yeah, I mean, occupational therapy nowadays, again, is one that is generally accepted to be educational. It's not quite as sort of core education as speech and language is, but it's again, a lot rarer nowadays than it was 10 or 15 years ago to see a local authority attempt to argue that occupational therapy is not educational or wouldn't fall within Part 3 or Section F of an EHC plan.
And that, in Jackie's case, might be because she finds the environment at the school too overwhelming, and they might need some support from an occupational therapist to advise them on sensory strategies, etc.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, with EHC plans in particular, because of the way that one of the other changes that was brought in when EHC plans came into force was to treat health and social care provision, which educates or trains a young person, as educational provision that belongs in Section F. And that means that things like occupational therapy are now even more clearly than they were before educational, because the purpose of it is to assist in the education of the child or young person by dealing with their sensory difficulties and advising on strategies to assist them to cope with those.
Chris, we see quite a lot, don't we? Statements of special educational needs and educational healthcare plans where local authorities try and argue that we'll come to that in the future. We will decide that provision in the future. What do you think about that? We see that quite a bit.
I mean, the intention of the system is that the statement specifies provision, as I've said, and that means that it needs to be set out now. And so, as a general rule, the tribunal always makes clear that local authorities can't leave provision in, or simply say within the plan occupational therapy to be advised or to be assessed by a therapist and then put in place. Obviously that doesn't give any indication as to what is in fact going to be provided, and will undoubtedly lead to the potential for disputes down the line as to whether that assessment was accurate and whether the provision that's then in place complies with it. So the aim of the plan is to set out now a level of provision which is required. And so things like future assessment, also wording like subject to review or subject to being amended whenever the therapist says so, is all sorts of wording that isn't allowed, because the plan needs to make clear what's going to be put in place, and if it changes, or if there is to be a change in the future, then the plan needs to be changed, rather than allowing for somebody to make that decision on their own.
What about provision that's not available now but could be available in 2 months from now?
I mean, there is a level of flexibility for that, and again, the tribunal has looked at that and has said, I think the furthest they've looked at is a school placement that was available about 9 months down the line, and there was nothing else on the table at that point for that child. And the tribunal therefore endorsed that as being the appropriate provision to put in place. They did deal with the interim situation as well, but saying that this is what's needed and is not going to be available until a certain date in the future is potentially possible. Obviously, I don't think much longer than that would be realistically viable, just because it would obviously leave a child without provision potentially for a long time. But if there is something else being provided in the interim which may not be as good, or may not be ideal even, but is the best that's available pending the provision which is really needed, then that I think would be viable as a form of wording to put in a plan.
Can a statement or can education healthcare plan actually require the parents to provide something?
No, is the short answer to that, and although it still comes up from time to time that local authorities will include reference to parents making provision, the law is clear that the plan has to set out the provision the child needs and who's going to deliver it, but it can't require parents to do that. And among other things, it would be impossible then for local authorities to comply with their duty potentially, because they have no way of forcing parents to make provision. And if it did say that, and parents said, "I want £1 million to do it," that would the local authority would have little option but to pay that, which is not realistic. But the starting point is always that it can't require parents to make provision. There's an interesting question as to whether it can refer to provision being made by parents if parents do so voluntarily, or if they want to do it and are happy to do it and even feel that they need to be involved. And there's nothing wrong in a sense with it referring to parents being involved, as they fully ought to be, in planning and discussions and decision making regarding the right approaches for their child. But it can't require parents to act as support people, for example, and it certainly can't require them to arrange or fund particular provision. And that's the local authority's duty and always has been.
Chris, you might see also statements requiring somebody else to fund, not just the parents. What do you think about that?
I mean, not in terms of educational provision, no. Again, obviously with healthcare provision, it will refer to the health and clinical commissioning bodies, and they will be the ones required to ensure that provision is made. But when it comes to educational provision, the plan is not focused on delivery or who provides it. The plan is focused on what the child needs, and the law creates the obligation on the local authority, the education department in practice, to ensure that all of that provision is delivered. And they can ask other people to do it, and there are various requirements within the legislation that other public bodies have to cooperate with local authorities and assist with making provision. But the duty is on the local authority education team, and the plan will not say, or even if it does, that someone else will have to do it. It will only say that a child needs X, or should only say that.
When you say the plan might say somebody else might do it, what about a school? If it says the school should do this, not us, the school must pay for this.
I mean, again, the short answer is if the plan records that the provision is necessary, and even if it says the school must do this, if the school don't, the local authority have to ensure that happens. And in a sense, if the local authority are confident that they can ensure the school will do it, in theory they could put that wording in there. But as a practical matter, if the school say we're not doing it, the local authorities and the legal duty would still fall back on the local authority to ensure that it happens.
It's often all about the school though, Chris, isn't it? I mean, parents will contact us and say, I want this school, before they even look at sections 2 or 3 or parts B and F. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the school is a vital part of the package, and identifying where all of this provision is going to be delivered is key, and obviously is sometimes the main concern and the major concern and the major issue that's really going to impact on the child's future. So when it comes to, again, sort of our approach to these things and the way the law approaches it as well, the starting point is that one has to go through the plan in a sensible order and not deal with school before you've dealt with provision. The way that the law requires the local authority to make that determination means that they have to identify the appropriate provision first and then go on to determine what school or placement should be named within the plan that can meet all of that provision. And so when a draft plan is sent out to parents, sections B and F will already be completed, or at least drafted by the local authority, subject to parental comments. But the school placement, section I, is left blank in the plan to allow the parents to start off by putting forward their preference in terms of school placement to deliver the provision that's being proposed. And so when parents get that, they will generally put forward their school placement, and the local authority then has to make that decision in finalising the plan as to whether either to name the school of parental preference or to name some other school placement.
Does it have to be a particular school, Chris? Could it involve any school?
And when parents are putting forward their preference, they don't have to name a particular school. They can also identify a type of school if they don't have a particular placement available already and are still looking themselves. Obviously, it's very helpful in most situations to be able to name a particular school, but where that's not possible, a type is permissible as well. But beyond that, parents can, in principle, put forward any type of school, and indeed any particular school, whether it's a state school or a private school, which they think will be appropriate and suitable to meet their child's needs.
We often see local authorities sometimes saying, well, it has to be a Section 41 approved school before you can elect a preference.
Yeah, I mean, Section 41 obviously deals with independent schools which have gone through that approval process to be named within an EHC plan. But that doesn't preclude independent schools which are not Section 41 approved from being named in a plan or being requested by parents. Section 41 gives parents an additional right, effectively, to insist on local authorities naming those schools, which those schools have all signed up to. But independent schools that don't sign up to that, if they are willing and happy to offer a place and able to accommodate the child's needs, can also be named and can therefore also be requested.
So really, it's any school a parent can elect. They could say, I want this school down the road, an independent school or a mainstream school down the road that we want for our child, or a special school.
Yeah, so they can identify the school that they want and that they think best. Obviously, sometimes, and it always depends on the particular circumstances, sometimes there's only one potential school which will be suitable, and other local schools, because of their lack of provision and everything else, are not going to be suitable. If there's only one suitable place, that's a straightforward decision. If there are lots of potential suitable placements, then there can be a need to think about whether there is a realistic prospect of either the local authority or, on appeal, the tribunal agreeing to a particular placement, because there are restrictions that the local authority and tribunal have on what they can name and must name.
Well, if a school, let's say a parent has called for, is not a Section 41 school, and we're at the draft education or statement stage, does the local authority have to consult that school?
Yeah, so the local authority is required to consult with the school that the parents put forward, and should anyway, as a matter of good practice in terms of making a decision. Consult with the school and investigate its suitability and its ability to make provision. That doesn't stop the local authority also consulting other schools of its choice or those that it considers might be appropriate as well. And indeed it should consult any school that it is considering naming instead if it may come to that view. We see a lot of local authorities that say, before we will name an independent school, whether it's Section 41 or not, and particularly where it's not, they will say we need to investigate and exhaust local placements and maintain placements first before we can name the independent school, which doesn't quite reflect the legal framework, but it does in practice often have an impact, because obviously a maintained school will often be less expensive.
But if they don't consult the school, then of course they will never know the benefits of that school.
Yeah, so I mean that's why there is the obligation to consult any school that they're considering naming, to ensure that the school has had the opportunity to identify any issues from their side as to whether they can meet the child's needs, or to confirm that they can and that they have places available. And so, whichever school it is, the local authority should be consulting with them first.
Do you not see sometimes local authorities argue that they only should consult the schools that are set out in Section 38 of the Children and Families Act, and that is the mainstream school, a special school, or a Section 41 school?
Yeah, I mean, some local authorities do take that line. As I say, there are those that argue they need to consult with their own first.
Yes.
Which is also not very helpful, as it delays matters more than anything else. But there are also those that won't consult with independent schools and have to be pushed to do so and forced to do so. Obviously, in a lot of cases where parents come to us with appeals or plans that have been finalised, they will themselves have been in contact with the independent school in some way, and may have already arranged an assessment there even, and may have an offer of a place. And if that's already there, a local authority consultation, although theoretically necessary, probably won't add very much to what the school has already been able to give and has already said to the parents. But with those independent schools that do require local authority referrals, which are still out there, then obviously it's important that local authorities are pushed in those cases to consult with them.
We hear the term waking day curriculum a lot, Chris, don't we? Sometimes parents would want a residential school. And it might be because it's just simply the next nearest school, or it may be that they need a waking day curriculum.
Yeah, I mean, those are the two. Waking day curriculum is used for those cases where, or as a shorthand sometimes, for those cases where a residential placement is needed for educational reasons, as opposed to the sort of practical reason that it's simply the nearest school and it's too far away to travel to on a day basis. And so when looking at whether a child has an educational need for provision beyond the normal school day, which would be what they would receive in a day placement, and therefore a need to board or to be present at the school for longer than normal hours, then the waking day is used as the shorthand sometimes for that, and the way of identifying the sort of provision and placement that is needed. And what it focuses on is whether a child has a need for educational provision going beyond the normal school day, which is something that is obviously a very complex issue sometimes, and has to be focused on very, very heavily with expert evidence to identify what is educational as opposed to what is social and non-educational, and also what is just a need, for example, for consistency throughout the day, which is not necessarily educational.
And a local authority might also be met with a parent who wants a particular mainstream school. And what would you say to that parent if a local authority says, well, no, you can't go there, it's going to be too expensive?
Well, the local authority, when it receives a parental preference, has to make a decision ultimately, once it's done its consultation processes, as to what it names within the EHC plan. And the position is slightly different from a legal point of view when it's a mainstream school as against an independent school, which is not a Section 41 school. But in broad terms, the grounds on which a local authority can refuse to name the school of parental preference are obviously the same, whichever route you go down. And the three broad headings that one always looks at are whether the school is a suitable placement for the child, whether it has a place available, or the impact on the education of other children if they go there, and then the cost. And so cost is always a relevant consideration when it comes to school placement. It's not at any earlier stage, but it is at the school placement stage a potential ground on which a local authority can properly reject a placement of parental preference if they have a suitable alternative which is going to genuinely be less expensive.
So, is it easy, do you think, for a local authority to say it's just simply too expensive?
It's easy for local authorities to say it. A lot of the time,
to prove it.
Proving it is sometimes more difficult for them, because a lot of the time they will say it without having properly assessed it. One often, at the outset of an appeal, will ask the local authority for those details, and they don't have them, and they're provided very late in the day in a lot of appeals as to the cost comparison that the local authority says is the difference between the two placements. So it's certainly something that local authorities find it easy to say. Proving it and the calculation of the cost of a school placement is not always a straightforward thing either. For an independent school which charges fees, It can be more straightforward because those fees are often known in advance and published and are standardised. With a state school, identifying what the cost of a placement is and how one calculates that through the national school funding frameworks is far more difficult. And there's a lot of case law and a lot of tribunal history in fighting through those issues and determining that. So there are a lot of factors when it comes to costs that need to be taken into account.
What about a parent who says, well, my child's so stressed that if he were not to go to this particular school, he's going to have a breakdown, he's going to require support from social services, we're going to need help in the home, all those kind of costs. Are those costs, do you think, that the local authority must take into account?
I mean, potentially so. I mean, as with all such things, when it comes to education and social care provision, it's going to be very fact-specific. So for a parent simply to say that may not itself be enough. There would need to be some medical evidence and confirmation to show that that is the position and that not going to a particular school would have that particular impact on the child. I mean, it may also affect the suitability question to start with as to whether the school is or another school is an appropriate placement for the child. If that's the case, and that it genuinely is that the only suitable school for that child that won't cause them to have a breakdown is the one school that is being put forward, then cost doesn't come into it because it's the only suitable school. If it comes to looking at, it would need to be, if he went anywhere else, there would need to be a raft of other support put in place to prevent that sort of breakdown. Again, subject to the evidence demonstrating that that's the case, then those are public costs that would need to be incurred in that placement but not in the parent's placement, and so is absolutely costs that can then be taken into account.
And what happens if you get to a point, Chris, where you've made your case and the local authority, let's say, has rejected it? What then? What then with the education plan or statement?
Well, I mean, obviously, once the local authority has finalised the plan and sent that out in the way that it's required to do at the end of the process, and formally served it on parents, if you don't agree with it and if the provision isn't sufficiently detailed and if it doesn't name the school that parents want, then the primary remedy for that is an appeal through the Special Educational Needs Tribunal process, the Welsh Tribunal or the English Tribunal. Prior to doing that, there is the mediation stage that people are required to go through, which requires them at least to speak to a mediator. It doesn't require them to actually have a mediation meeting with the local authority if parents decide not to do that. But sometimes that can be a useful approach to try and resolve matters without the need for a full appeal. In other cases, we will say actually mediation is probably not going to assist in this particular situation, whether it's because it's premature, and in particular if the parents at that stage don't have all of the supporting evidence they would need, then it can be a lot trickier to pursue mediation, and because of the time limits for appealing and mediating, it can sometimes be necessary just to move on with an appeal. But,
do you lose your mediation rights then when you've moved on to appeal?
And once the appeal process starts, then the sort of formal mediation process that you're required to go through doesn't apply anymore. It certainly doesn't stop parents and local authorities from continuing to negotiate and to discuss matters, whether it's through a different formal mediation process or some other formal process, or just through correspondence and sort of back and forward of discussion that should be taking place and the tribunal expects to take place through what it calls the working document, which is a way of identifying the issues and trying to narrow them between the parties. So in most appeals about the contents of an EHC plan, the discussions will go on long beyond any formal mediation stage, and there will be movement and hopefully some progress made during the course of the appeal in terms of the contents of the plan. It's usually obviously the school is the major sticking point in a lot of appeals, and if that can be resolved, everything else sometimes falls into place.
Well, you've heard it. The education healthcare plan, you've seen how important it is. The wording must be clear, must be concise, must be intelligible, must be sufficiently specific. It's very important to get those things right. So the advice I give you when you are getting these plans sent to you at home is to look at them carefully, see whether or not all the needs are covered at the relevant section of the statement or the education healthcare plan, and then of course go on to see that the provision is appropriate, to make sure that your child will receive all that the special educational needs demand. And then when it comes to it, you can ask for your particular school, you might ask for an independent school, you might ask for a mainstream school. And the authority must go through the motions of considering that request, considering that school, looking at whether or not that's going to be too expensive or not, and if it's too expensive, to put its case to you so you understand precisely what the benefits and burdens may be. And then, if you still don't resolve that dispute at that point, you have your right to go to mediation, if you're in England, of course, but there are dispute resolution mechanisms also in place in Wales. And if you have gone through that motion and you really still can't get the result that you want, you have the right to go to a special needs tribunal. And of course, a further presentation later will talk about the Special Education Needs Tribunal and what you need to think about there. So that's all for this presentation. Thank you very much indeed.